this country and this region has thousands of years of history that I'm only trying to catch up with quickly, and your country is very, very beautiful, and a lot of wonderful ideas, and so it's a real treat to be here. What I'm trying to do in my work these days is to support global ideas and an interconnected world society at peace. So that's my idealism, which is that we should try to find a way to live together more cooperatively and to work together globally to achieve shared objectives. And the two main objectives that I think are most important are sustainable development and demilitarization. And I would say on both of these we're not succeeding very well. The world society is not in cooperative spirit, and we're not solving problems of sustainable development, and if anything we're entering a new arms race among major powers, which I think is very dangerous. So I spend most of my time now working on both of those topics, but especially the sustainable development challenge. And by sustainable development, I mean, and the UN means societies that are prosperous, fair, and environmentally sustainable. And so the idea is to watch not only GDP, but also to watch the distribution of income, the access to quality public services, the overcoming of gender bias and discrimination, the overcoming of discrimination against minority groups, and the attention to the environmental crises. And we have three big environmental crises. Nothing is simple. We have the climate change crisis, we have the biodiversity destruction, and we have the pollution crisis. And all three of them are very, very large. So my basic idea is that we ought to spend our resources and our attention towards solving the problems of extreme poverty, the lack of quality public services, the unfairness in income distribution, and the environmental damages. And so I'm a big fan of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the objectives that all of the United Nations countries, all 193 countries, adopted in 2015 as guiding principles for how our economy should work and how we should cooperate globally. The United Nations, where I work most of the time, I'm at Columbia University, but I divide my time between the university and the United Nations. The UN is a very good idea, but a very difficult idea too. It's a good idea that we should have an international cooperative system based on law, but it's also a very difficult idea because the United States and other big powers don't like it very much, to be told what to do, especially by smaller countries or by international law. And things like the Sustainable Development Goals are not enforceable. So the whole international system is based on either treaties or declarations or other principles that cannot be enforced by normal mechanisms that maybe are enforceable within a country. And some people say, therefore, it's useless to even engage in such efforts. I just think it's not useless because they're so important. I just think it's difficult. And so I'm rather eager to try to make the difficult successful rather than giving up on the difficult. The alternative, I view, is like having a world of Donald Trumps, which is a horrible world where you have each person a little bit crazy, saying America first, or Russia first, or this one first, or that one first, and don't tell me what to do. And that kind of world is extremely dangerous, unfortunately, and a very selfish world also, and very difficult for countries like Georgia, which are small population, very vulnerable to really flourish. And so that's why I take the view that we should spend our effort, and countries like Georgia, which are small population, vulnerable in the midst of much larger powers, like Russia, of course, the biggest power in the region, or even neighbors like Turkey or Iran, should really emphasize the importance of the United Nations and the rule of law and insist on that kind of approach. So that's partly why I'm here, in addition to the honor of getting an honorary degree yesterday from your wonderful university, and I'm really very grateful for that. And I'm going tomorrow to Azerbaijan for the first time, so I've never been to this region before, and that's a shame. But one of the reasons finally that we made it is that our son and daughter-in-law came to Georgia many years ago and said it's the most wonderful place. You have to go. Insisting, and of course they were right to tell their parents this is a high priority. When it comes to sustainable development, let me just say a few words about what I have in mind. You know, the idea of sustainable development is a kind of balanced society that is prosperous, but also pays attention to the poor and to the vulnerable, to the weak, to those in need, and also pays attention to the environment. And it requires a certain kind of political and economic setup to have that orientation. In the United States, for example, we don't have that orientation at the national level. And the reason is that the United States political system and economic system is mainly geared towards making money and towards the first of the objectives, economic wealth, but not so much towards fairness or justice or help for the poor, and these days not at all for environmental sustainability. So the U.S. is an example of a country that's very, very rich, but very unequal and very environmentally destructive. And we have a president who is a little bit nutty, actually, to use a technical term. I think he's clinically deranged, actually. And most of the psychologists I talk to believe that he is megalomaniac, paranoid, and sadistic, so psychopathic. And I think that that's probably a realistic assessment of this person. He should not be president, unfortunately. But it means that we're in an environment of a lot of greed, a lot of deregulation, industry, to allow pollution, to really allow reckless behavior. And so our oil industry is very polluting. Our drug industry is very greedy and discriminatory. And basically, our big companies run the politics in the United States now also. We don't regulate the big companies regulate us. So Facebook tells us what to do, steals all our data. Now we had a crash of the new Boeing plane, but the United States is the only one that says, oh, continue to fly. And one of the reasons is the new Secretary of Defense comes from Boeing, and the head of Boeing called the President of the United States yesterday because the companies tell the politicians what to do in the United States rather than government being effective regulators. So the United States ends up being a place where if you want to get rich, it's not bad. If you're a billionaire, there are a lot of nice restaurants and a lot of nice places to live. But if you are looking for transparent government, you won't find it these days. It's really not a good situation. And so the United States is really unable to focus on things like sustainable development for the moment. We have an election coming up next year, so we're still a democracy. And I support Bernie Sanders, so we'll see how he does. But there's the good thing about the United States is we can fix ourselves. We're not blocked from opening our eyes and realizing the problems. And that is really the plus of an open society, that we can regain some sense, but I'm not sure we will, but we're going to try in any event. But for countries like Georgia, I think it's really important to have an economic development strategy that is more holistic than just economic growth. Most of the measurement of the performance of the economy here would be how fast is the growth. And that's not completely unreasonable because GDP per capita gives a certain indication of that's meaningful. It's the first number I would look at for assessing an economy. And I spent 40 years assessing economies, so if I'm taking a diagnosis like a medical doctor of an economy, the first number I would look at, like the blood pressure or the weight, the first number I would look at is GDP per capita. But then the next number I would look at is life expectancy, and the third number I would look at is the Gini coefficient for measures of inequality. The fourth number I would look at is the air quality index over Tbilisi on any given day, and how clean is the air. The fifth number I would look at probably is the share of renewable energy as part of the total, and there Georgia's in good shape. You're very lucky you don't have any fossil fuels, so you're luckier than Azerbaijan and Russia and other places because fossil fuels drive countries crazy and give them hubris and arrogance, but you're stuck with clean energy by and large. That's much better. It will give you clearer thinking for the future. So the idea of sustainable development is to look at a number of different indicators, and also quality of schools, quality of education, quality of healthcare, and all of those different dimensions, and to try to make a society that is well balanced. Not only how can we get rich, but how can we achieve economic, social, and environmental objectives all together. Maybe I'll just end with one observation. I edit 2 reports each year, which you could find online, and I'd encourage you to take a look at them. One is called the World Happiness Report, and that's a report that studies how people around the world assess their own well-being. And the report for 2019 will come on March 20th, so in 1 week from today, which is World Happiness Day at the United Nations. We'll release it at the UN in a week. And you'll see where Georgia ranks on the self-assessment based on a survey taken in 150 countries. And then the other report is called the Sustainable Development Goal Index. And that is a measure of how countries are doing on the SDGs, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Well, the interesting thing about those two reports is that the countries at the top of the list are the same in both reports. They're the Scandinavian countries that are the happiest reports and the most sustainable development reports. So I'm a big fan of Scandinavia as the best role model in the world of how a balanced society would work. Very prosperous, fair, universal services, gender equality, high life expectancy, and environmental sustainability. So all of those pieces put together. And for me, my main recommendation to any country is study these cases, think about the next 10 to 20 years, and think about the policies that a country needs over a time period of 10 to 20 years. This is a little bit different from macroeconomics, which is especially about the short-run business cycle. It's a little bit different from microeconomics, where when you study, you learn about markets and market efficiency and so on. It's really about a mixed economy, a large role of government and a large role of private enterprise, international trade, public services, a lot of taxation to pay for public health and public education and public infrastructure, a big attention to the environment, and the need for planning on a time horizon of 10 to 20 years. And I can tell you when the Soviet Union, I think we were in the Gosplan, we are in the Gosplan building.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was...
It was the Institute under the Gosplan.
Institute, okay. So I was in Gosplan in Red Square in 1990. I was the first Westerner, I was told. I don't know if they were just flattering me or not, but I was told that I was the first Westerner on the 7th floor of Gosplan. And when you got off the elevator, there was a bust of Karl Marx about 6 feet wide to greet us. And I briefed the head of Gosplan at the time, Mr. Yuri Maslakov, who was head of the military-industrial complex and Politburo member of the Soviet Union. I briefed him about market economy. So I know about Gosplan a little bit from 29 years ago, and I explained why central planning was not a good idea. But I didn't mean that planning isn't a good idea. So what the West said, especially the United States, is the Soviet Union was central planning, so we should never plan anything. So in the United States, the length of the plan is Donald Trump's tweet. We have no plans. We just have the imagination and fantasy world of the President of the United States. It's a very fascinating fantasy world, but it is not exactly a plan. And we don't have a planning ministry or any way to look forward right now. So I just want to be understood. I am not in favor of Gosplan to recreate that, but I am in favor of planning, especially planning the budget over 10 years, planning public services, planning infrastructure, which requires a long forward look. And all countries need to get green, clean, 100% renewable energy, and improve public services, and that requires a long-term strategy. So that's what I'm trying to promote, that kind of mixed economic system. Well, that's enough rambling. I said I wanted to have some chance to have or to hear questions or comments, and I would really be eager to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I will say a few words if you allow me. Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Because we rushed into the room, we were discussing about the Cold War, and I got a bit distracted, and then Professor Sachs started straight away, so there was no introduction. But I want to just say a few words about Professor Sachs. We had the luxury of spending the last 3 days in Georgia showing Professor Sachs around the country, or at least Tbilisi and Treta. And there's really, for me, 3 things that stood out that might be useful to all of us. And then, so I will just say this for a minute or two, and then we would open for questions. So for me, there's really 3 things about Professor Sachs and how he has approached his life that I think can be very valuable. The first one is that he has a very clear goal about what he wants to achieve. And he wants to improve the livelihoods of everybody in this planet. So it's a very ambitious goal, but it is really one, and not just economically, but just life, happiness, as Professor Sachs mentioned. So I think very important to have a very clear goal, as ambitious as possible. Then he has a plan, as opposed to some people in the US, but he has a plan, and this plan is the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course all the things related to that. So he really has been able to develop a very clear plan of how we need to reach this goal that he set for himself and for the world. And I think that is really something that is really important to consider. Not just goals, but also plans. I look at Georgians because a lot of Georgians have a lot of goals. And not just Georgians, but a lot of people in general have a lot of goals, but they don't create a plan to get there. And finally, I think what struck me throughout the last few days, and especially today, was how honest and open, while getting to this goal and delivering the plan, Professor Sachs is, both in his political views, as we've seen, but just in general as well, about everything. So with that said, it was really a pleasure to have this lecture, and I would like to take some questions on behalf of ISET.
Dr. Sachs, huge thanks for your presentation. It's really a great chance for us to meet you and to hear your opinions, which were very interesting and very open-ended. My question is, going back to your country, which is the greatest country in the world, and sort of sets an example, and now it's not a good example. And it's not just Trump. Trump was sort of a check of the system not working properly, I think, and maybe there will be somebody else in that seat soon. Hopefully Bernie Sanders. I can't vote, but I hope many people will. But the fact that periodically there are leaders that are really going after money and other values rather than sustainable development means that for many years probably it will be really hard to achieve what kind of you are hoping to achieve. Do you see any change in big powers? I mean, small countries it's a difficult question, but big countries is a more difficult question. So what is your hope for the countries like United States, for example, in terms of changing the political structure to be able to address better the sustainable future that you're talking about?
Thank you very much. I find geopolitics very important and very interesting, and of course Georgia exemplifies the interesting dimension of geopolitics for the last 2,000 years, because how many times this country has fallen under one empire or another empire or another empire. You have to be very, very attuned to the regional and the global politics. And we're in a period of change right now that is pretty basic. The period, say, from 1800 to 1950 was an Imperial Age. It was the age of the big European empires. Russia was its own distinct case because it was a late industrializer, but very much an empire, of course. And Britain was the dominant economic empire for 150 years because industrialization came first to Britain, and Britain became the predominant imperial power in the world. That period ended for two basic reasons. One is that Europe had 30 years of the bloodiest civil war disasters imaginable, from World War I, Great Depression, and World War II, which was basically from 1914 to 1945, one bloody, disastrous mess. There was an interlude of non-war, but it was a Great Depression in between. And so Europe had 30 years of complete disaster. And at the same time, the ideas of industrialization, technology, literacy, and so forth spread throughout the world. And so most of the countries under colonial or imperial power, if they could, they said, get the hell out of here. So by the end of World War II, Europe retreated from most empires, not Russia. It was renamed as the Soviet Union in 1923, but the Russian Empire persisted for a lot longer by virtue of Russia's being on the victorious side of the war against fascism in the 1930s and 1940s. At the end of World War II, the United States was by far the dominant economic power of the world, because World War II hadn't landed except one day in the United States. So we had one day of fighting, which was December 7, 1941, when Japan bombed our naval fleet in Hawaii. Other than that, the US was untouched, and it had built a huge, huge industrial base. Really remarkable, because the war was a boom for the US economy, and for technology, because there were so many advances of technology during the war. Radar and semiconductors and countless electronics advances and computation. And so at the end of World War II, the US had an astounding industrial base. It was by far the world's leading technological builder. So many great scientists from Germany and Europe came to the United States, so the scientific brain power of the US was unbelievable, much of it imported, and the US became the dominant economic power in the world by far. And that defined a lot of the post-war period. For a while, the United States did a pretty good job of this. Especially, my favorite president was Franklin Roosevelt, who I think was a great president, both a great Democrat and a great leader. And he not only did a good job in politics and in leading the US in World War II, but also in creating the United Nations as an idea, which I regard as America's most important foreign policy idea. Of course, there was the Cold War from 1945 to 1991 also, and Russia was militarily, or Soviet Union was very powerful because by 1947 Russia had the bomb and then the nuclear arms race. But Russia was never close technologically to the United States or economically close to the United States. The gap was always quite enormous. And the central planning system was a lousy idea, actually. It just was a bad design. Unfortunately, it was a bad design in a one-party state, so it persisted until it finally collapsed in the 1980s. So during this period, the United States was geopolitically very dominant, and for much of the time did an okay job in the international institutions. Of course, with one big mistake, which was power brings arrogance. And so the United States was very arrogant many, many times in foreign policy, like in fighting in Vietnam, or many other places where the US said, we overthrow you, we want a new government, and so on. And on many occasions, the United States didn't abide by any rules, but just abided by power. And most of the time that ended up very, very badly. When the Soviet Union collapsed economically at the end of the 1980s, first Eastern Europe became independent of Soviet power because Gorbachev said go, and they went quickly, as fast as possible, I can tell you. I was there. And then when in 1991, the Soviet Union ended in December 1991, and by the way, just by coincidence, I was actually there that day also. Literally, I was sitting in a room in the Kremlin. This is no joke. And Boris Yeltsin came in the other door, because I was there to advise him. And he sat down at the table, and we had a bunch of men on our side. And so he said, gentlemen, I wish to inform you the Soviet Union is over. And we shook, and he said, because in that next room, I just met the military leadership of the Soviet Union. They have agreed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It was something like December 11, 1991. So it was quite an interesting moment to be there. But when that happened, the United States said, great, we are now the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. Nobody can touch us. We're the most powerful country since the Roman Empire. In fact, we're more powerful than the Roman Empire. We can do anything we want. And it looked like the United States was the all-powerful country. And then many people said, you can't even use the term superpower because it's hyper-superpower, and so on. Well, this kind of idea goes to your brain, and it creates a lot of bad leaders, people who are a little unhinged. Now we have something like Caligula as our emperor, but probably that's a disservice to Caligula, I don't know. But in any event, you go a little bit crazy, so the United States decided it would start overthrowing governments that it didn't like. It would overthrow the government in, of course, Saddam Hussein, it would overthrow Muammar Gaddafi, it would overthrow Bashar al-Assad, and many other countries. Now it's trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela these days. And this is a bad habit of a superpower. It says we don't abide by the law. We choose who governs in different places. Well, it turns out it's not really feasible to do that. You don't really get very far. And one other big thing happened, which was not according to plan, and that was that China became a great power in the middle of this. This is really insulting to the United States, because when you're the heavyweight champion of the world, you don't want any contenders to want to challenge you for the throne. Or when you're the world chess champion, like Garry Kasparov, you don't want Magnus Carlsen to come along or anybody else. But China has come along, and so the geopolitics is also a little bit different from what the U.S. imagined just a quarter century ago. Now it's a much more open competition. And this is the context that we're in right now. The U.S. is very militarily powerful, but the military just can't solve most of the problems of the world. And so even if you overthrow a government like Saddam Hussein, it doesn't really matter. You just have a mess afterwards. You don't really have a solution. And so the U.S. is involved in messes all over the world, doesn't really know what to do about them. We don't have plans, so we have no strategy. The country's very confused because also inequality has become very high. So a lot of people are very unhappy, and they voted for a billionaire to save them, which is not unusual because you often find people like this that rise up and say, okay, I can solve all the problems, but be careful because they may not know very well what to do. And that's the situation we're in. And geopolitics is changing a lot. And we're in a technological massive change with the digital revolution. So what do we do with all of those things? My naive idea is that we focus on goals. And that we say we have certain goals. We want clean energy, we want universal health coverage, we want universal quality education, we want to end extreme poverty, and that by working on the goals, we can at least keep some attention and some common cooperation. Of course, this kind of thing is not Donald Trump's approach, and so we're very confused in the US right now, and we don't have any clear goals at all. Every day is a new political adventure. There are no objectives right now that are very clear, and it's just a fight for power. Power for what? I'm not sure, but just a daily fight for power. So, but the quality of life is going down in the US. This is very clear. Not for the top. People with high education are doing very well. People in business are doing well, but maybe 70% of the country is finding it very hard to pay the bills, to pay health care, to find quality education for their children. And a lot of people are addicted to drugs now. A lot of people are addicted to prescription medicines that have created a complete catastrophe in the United States, opiate addictions. And so what does this mean for Georgia? It means you can't depend on one, as unfortunately there's no savior country. And even NATO is, it's a mess right now. It's not a functioning base for global politics. So it's a very unusual and difficult situation. In Georgia's situation, there's no easy answer for that. You're a small nation surrounded by a lot of countries that are not the easiest neighbors in the world. At least you have about 5,000 years of experience with them. So you know something about them. So this is not a country with lots of illusions. Oh, they're great, aren't they sweet? Isn't it nice? So at least you have that good experience to keep your feet on the ground. But unfortunately, I would say there's no ready, easy answer. And I know that the goal here is European Union membership and NATO membership and so forth, but it's going to be very complicated. Even Europe is in such a bad shape, and if you watch what's the debate in the UK, it's almost a tragedy to see how absurd that country has become. It went from the reigning superpower of the world 75 years ago to almost pathetically incoherent. Now, we watched an hour of the vote yesterday on Brexit. You can't imagine grown-ups talking like this in the world. They make no sense at all, but their English is perfect. So, as an American, I'm in awe of how well they speak. But what they're saying makes no sense. And so this is really, this is a big problem. So this is why there's so much flux. But what is true for everybody is climate change is a mess, air pollution is a mess, people want decent health care, they want education. And what's beautiful right now on the positive side is the new technologies are so good. Artificial intelligence, self-driving vehicles, new material science, 3D printing. The technologies are wonderful, that we could really have an age of affluence that is general if we're smart about it. So the one thing that's really excellent is our technologies. And if we make use of them effectively, then we're not limited by even land, water, air. We have to be careful, but we have the solutions available technologically to really improve living standards around the world. That's our best hope. Of course, to do that requires, again, responsible government, global cooperation, and regulation of business. And that's politically a big challenge, and a good strategy. So national plans, and a good strategy for how to accomplish this.
Hello, Professor. Welcome to ISET. I'm Mohammed. I'm from Iran.
Great.
First of all, economists were successful to more or less overthrow the communism. But now we are facing with another problem, which is raising its populism. And populism leaders are doubled from 2000 almost.
Yeah.
And it's against what you said exactly, sustainable development, even peace, even human rights. What's the exact and clear answer of economists toward this phenomenon? Thank you.
So I think there's an economics approach, and I think that there's a political question. The economic approach is that the kind of society that we need is a mixed economic system. And again, I will refer to my favorite economies, the Scandinavian economies. If you take a country like Sweden or Norway or Denmark, they are mostly private, capitalistic enterprises. They're competing in world markets. Trade is very open. And the countries in that region, because they're all small economies, Sweden has 10 million people, Norway 4 million people, Denmark 4 or 5 million people, they know no one's going to save them, we have to be competitive. So they're very oriented toward world markets, high technology, excellent education. That's part of the strategy. But then at the same time, they're very socially oriented. Everybody gets health care, everybody gets public education, everybody gets free tuition. How do they pay for that? Taxes, taxes, and taxes. They tax 40 or 50% of GDP. And then they say, okay, now we have enough public revenues, we make sure that all of these services are universally available. This system is called social democracy. That is both an economic strategy and the name of a political party, but it's mainly an economic strategy. So small s, small d is a philosophy of economic management which says mixed economy, and in Sweden it used to be called the middle way from the 1930s onward. To my mind, it's the most successful system we've seen on the planet in the last 100 years in creating well-being, broad prosperity. Not the richest people in the world, but broad prosperity and good functioning of the economy. So this is what I would recommend economically. To understand that, of course, it has to be modernized for the 21st century. And one of the interesting things about all three of the Scandinavian countries, or all the Nordic countries, because Finland is like this, Iceland is like this, Netherlands is like this, Germany is like this, there's a lot of institutional innovation taking place. It's not a static system, but it's an innovating system. So to my mind, this is a good starting point. Now, how to get there? It only works in peace. It only works if you're not spending a huge amount on the military. And it only works if you get along with your neighbors also. Because almost everything that we need to accomplish requires economies of scale, cooperation, and infrastructure that is at regional scale. So if I could make a magic wand for this region, it would be cooperation from the northern Caucasus through Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and of course the three countries of the South Caucasus region, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Right now we have nothing like that. Politics is frozen between Russia and Georgia because of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Azerbaijan and Armenia don't talk to each other. Iran is, because of the United States, a pariah state that is, we're not even supposed to, you know, I'm not supposed to be talking to you probably. You know, it's, if my government finds out, I will just get my passport taken away. You know, it's, and Americans are crazy because they've been at war with the Iranian people since 1953, basically since overthrowing Mossadegh. It's unbelievable because if you ask Americans, name 2 cities in Iran, you couldn't find 1 in a million that could do so. They know nothing except that Iran's the enemy. So it's so crazy, mindless, stupid. You can't even believe how crazy my country is. And this is a really serious problem. But for this country, for example, it's very hard for Georgia to reach any kind of potential if Armenia and Azerbaijan are, you know, can't talk to each other, or if transport among the 3 countries is so difficult. If Russia would be peaceful and normal, and the relations with these 2 small regions would be normalized, that by itself would be another 20% boost of GDP, at least. Tourism, infrastructure, other solutions are held back. If some miracle happened and Turkey, the Gulf countries, and Iran found peaceful relations, the benefit for the Middle East would be historic. So much of what is going on is division. And by the way, a lot of the division is the deliberate division of the United States, because divide et impera, divide and conquer, is the oldest strategy since the Roman Empire or before, and that's a US strategy. And also, the problem of every small country is if we could just get one big power on our side, we're safe, which is usually not true at all. But Saudi Arabia believes, as long as the United States is on our side, we can be as obnoxious as we want. That's why, and they pay a lot of people in the United States, a lot of corruption, a lot of money. And so the Saudis pay the bills for the US. There's a whole industry funded by Saudi Arabia. And what does Saudi Arabia want? It wants to fight Iran. The United States is happy to go along, because if there's money involved, no problem. This is a lot of the problem that we're facing, rather than any kind of sense of what we want. And look at, again, what does the United States want from Saudi Arabia? For Saudi Arabia to buy $100 billion of military equipment to use against your country. Okay, how insane is this? First of all, why would anyone ship military hardware to a war zone without expecting disaster? Second, what the hell is Saudi Arabia doing, wasting $100 billion on the military when it needs to reform its country fundamentally? When you need the money for science, education, shift to renewable energy, and when the whole region, places like Yemen, need reconstruction, Syria, reconstruction, building. So this is what's wrong with our economy. We're not directing resources at all to what we really need. We're directing them towards ridiculous purposes that are incredibly costly and that are leading nowhere. That's the problem. And with Iran, by the way, we had a wonderful visit to Tehran a couple of years ago. There's so much need for environmental help. Dust storms, sandstorms, drying surface waters. It's an environmental catastrophe, actually, that's underway. Half of it coming from the Middle East, because it's coming from Iraq. The sands are coming across the border, so we need regional solutions for these things, and that's where the money should be invested. And one more war in this region, there's not only no sustainable development, there's no hope. And so that's really why peace is the most important economic strategy imaginable.
Two more questions.
Hello everybody, thanks for coming to ISET. So my question is, why is...
Introduce yourself.
My name is Reza Beroze, alumni of ISET. So I'm kind of sort of teaching the open economics as well.
Great.
So my question is, why is beautiful minds like you losing against all this stupidity?
Yeah. It's really an interesting question. I don't know the answer. Not to make it particular or personal, but why is it that so many places are in massive political confusion right now. The US, we have the worst president in our history by far. Britain is falling to pieces, not only over Brexit, but Scotland may still want to leave. They just may fall apart. Almost every country is in some kind of difficult crisis right now. It pushes one to think about what are the common elements for the reason for these crises in so many places. And I can think of the three, maybe four tendencies that I'd mentioned are common explanations. I'm not sure of the answer, but I think there are common explanations. One is that the US-led order is ending or ended in the world. So we're in a different geopolitics. Everything is less understandable, less predictable. No one knows anywhere who to align with, what to do, what is the strategy, and so on, because the old truth suddenly disappeared. And I think that that's a big deal. So that's one issue that I think is actually a major issue. We have to live in a multipolar world, not a US-led world, or not a Cold War world. And that's hard, and it's leading to a lot of confusion. Second, I think the changing technology, the digital revolution, is probably destabilizing all of our societies in ways that are complex and diverse. First of all, the inequality is rising, and I think this is related to the technological change. There's been a huge rise in the gap between skilled work and unskilled work almost everywhere. There's been a lot of mechanization of unskilled work, and so a lot of unemployment among people with low skills. So the tensions socially of division are widening. And always we've known I think we've seen in history many times that when there's a new communications technology, this also is destabilizing. So the social media is changing the world a lot. It's leading to the fake news, to the disinformation, to all of the games that Russia has been playing in many countries to destabilize information, and that's a pretty active process. The spying, the surveillance, even just the attention span of people is going down. So I think that there's a lot there that is happening. Third, and in general, people don't understand the world that we live in. None of us really. Maybe there's some good physicists here, but if you ask me, how does this really work? I don't know. How do I get my email, really, in terms of the technology, the systems, the design? I don't really know. Most of the systems we live in and depend on, even the air traffic system, what we're learning from this most recent crash, for example, who runs things, how does it work, who keeps us safe or not safe? There's very little understanding of most of this right now. And I think the alienation from technology is quite a serious part of the dislocations of people from their society. It's very hard to understand what's happening, even if you spend, like I do, spend every day, all the time trying to understand these things, and there's so many gaps in my knowledge, and I'm rather well trained and experienced and I have a complete network of people that I can call to ask for explanations, but there's so much complexity of this. And I know from experience, politicians don't know most of anything. They don't know what they're doing. But usually their ignorance is also combined with arrogance, and so it goes together, but they don't really know what they're doing on most of these issues. And then a fourth point is the ecological crisis, which is very widespread and creating a lot of dislocation already. So my sense is that we're in a lot of change. It's affecting people very unequally. It's very hard to understand. Attention is very disoriented. And so all of this is destabilizing our politics. And one of the things we've discovered, by the way, in the World Happiness Report is a huge increase of what psychologists call negative affect, which means you feel shitty. How did you feel yesterday is the question psychologists ask, and people say, not so good. Did you smile yesterday? Hell no. You know, were you under stress? Yes. That is going up worldwide quite sharply right now. Usually world patterns, when you survey them, don't change so much, but we're going to publish a chart next week which shows negative affect, like that. Pretty strange, actually. So I feel that this is not an easy time. And I'm a close witness to power because I see a lot of powerful people at the sideline. So I watch a lot. I think that it's nobody's in charge. And the fact that not only is the U.S. leadership weakening, but now we have really the worst imaginable leader. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Worse could even be coming. But we have somebody completely incompetent, mentally, intellectually, morally. That's really a derangement also, but it affects the whole world because people, for all the historical reasons I mentioned, expect something of the United States, not nothing. They expect something of the United States, and now we get nothing of the United States, but incoherence. So it's, I can't say it's just inside the U.S., it's happening everywhere. There's a wonderful writer who passed away a few years ago named Jane Jacobs. She was a philosopher of urban life and an urban specialist in the United States. And she wrote a couple of classic books about what makes cities great. And towards the end of her life, she wrote a book called The Coming Dark Age, which was a very pessimistic book about the coming ignorance, anti-science, anti-thinking, and so on. And it was written in about 2010. And it was very pessimistic. And I read it and I said, you know, she wrote some great books, but this is just a pessimistic book of an old lady. You know, maybe it's age, maybe it's just pessimism. And maybe what I'm saying is just an old man, you know, that I'm too pessimistic. And I don't mean, I'm not actually not pessimistic, I'm just worried. I'm not saying bad or good. And I'm not saying which way things will go. But what Jane Jacobs wrote had a lot of insight to it, which is just this loss of rigor in our thinking, loss of precision, loss of ethics, attention to detail. And it's not just a US phenomenon, it's quite widespread, but maybe because of these bigger geopolitics, technology, ecology are all part of this sense of an unstable period. Let me give you a grim example, but I don't want to make a too easy comparison, but 100 years ago, 110 years ago, 1910, the world was dynamic technologically. This was a booming age. Economic growth was worldwide. Industrialization was coming everywhere. Russia, by the way, was having a tremendous spurt of economic development between 1905 and 1914. If you were in 1910, you could have said this is a golden age of science, a golden age of technology. Indeed, Albert Einstein made special relativity and every other intellectual gigantic breakthrough of those years, quantum physics and everything else. And then World War I came, of a completely hopeless, deranged era. Why? You could ask. It's a similar kind of question. Why did that happen? And there was no particular explanation except that the world was in a lot of rapid change. And the rapid change meant that there was no equilibrium that was easily agreed. And in the end, it led to a military conflict. I'm very worried that we're in that kind of big change right now. And I don't see any voices that are world authority that are stabilizing right now. If you can't count on the US, if you can't count on any of the other big powers per se, it's very worrisome. So that's again why I'm turning to at least we could have shared goals. And that's very fragile. But the idea is that if we could share the ideas, maybe we don't need to share some of the other assumptions.
One last question.
Can I ask a question? So, basically...
Where?
First of all, you need to stand up. You need to introduce
I am
yourself.
standing right here.
Yeah. Use the mic.
Take a microphone.
Yeah, sure, why not? So what I wanted to ask was...
Is that working?
I'm not
Yes.
sure really. What I wanted to ask was basically... Test. Alright, so what I wanted to ask was basically...
Introduce yourself.
Sorry, what?
Introduce yourself.
Oh, my name's Yazan. I'm a student here, bachelor's. And what I wanted to ask was, throughout modern times, basically, you see people generally being a lot less trustworthy of democracy, a lot less trustworthy of liberty and liberal values, and basically constantly hoping that there will be like some kind of a strongman dictator just getting everything right and then just leave. Now, usually when someone says something like that, they ask, how can we prevent that? But what I want to ask is, like, should we entertain that idea? Okay, because you see a lot of these countries that do have authoritarian governments, such as China, okay, or Singapore, for example, had like around 30 years of the same party running. They all have the capacity to make like long-term planning and things like that in ways that democratic government are not able to do so. And sometimes I do feel that maybe there should be experts at the top rather than them being voted for to a certain extent. Basically, it being more like standard job. There should be some kind of requirements. But that's just me. I don't know. But yeah, you see this trend happening. Do you think that we should entertain that idea that maybe to a certain extent governments should be run in a more authoritarian manner?
I think there are a couple of things to unpack in those ideas. One is that I do think that our systems for, say, energy, connectivity, civil aviation, water, disease control, and so forth, should be run by experts primarily, not by politicians primarily. Having said that, we do need some kind of accountability for those systems as well, otherwise they become abused. But the idea of expertise is really important. We're looking at it right now after this crash of the Ethiopian Airlines. Properly, there should be a technical decision-making that is not subject to politics or to corruption to decide how to address this airline risk of this new 737 MAX airline of Boeing. And most of the countries of the world have suspended that plane, but the United States has said no, the plane continues to fly. And I'm worried that that's because politics came into what should be an expert system, that this is because of the political power of Boeing, not because of the appropriate decision-making about risks and precaution. And it became very political. And when one country stands against all of the other countries, that worries me that we're in the political realm. Power of this company, Boeing, is very powerful, as opposed to the technical realm. So I think the first thing to say is many things in our society need expertise, especially if we're going to solve the climate change problem, if we're going to solve the ecological problems and so on. So we need to put expertise in leadership, but then also you need to build in institutional control, because experts also have their own interests. You can't govern these complex systems without expertise, but you can't just say to experts you're unaccountable, because that also would be very dangerous. Then comes the political system, which is a little bit different, how political leaders are chosen. And I think that there are several different things to keep in mind here. First, to my mind, the most successful places in the world, if I could choose the political system, I would choose parliamentary systems with no presidents, because I don't believe in investing one person with so much authority anywhere. Now, that's easier said than done, but I think that the United States Constitution, made in 1789, it had as its model the kingdom of the United Kingdom. And so the idea of the president was something like our king, but not quite a king under constitutional rule. But if I were doing it again, I would definitely say I'd rather have Queen Elizabeth as our queen and a prime minister, frankly, than to have a president of the United States, because it's too powerful a position. And so part of what we need is to keep more disseminated power anywhere, because power really does corrupt. Psychologically, testosterone, brain structure, it's very corrupting. So this is one thing. Second, you mentioned two countries, Singapore and China. Singapore is the only case I know where somebody stayed in power for more than 2 decades and didn't blow it up. There may be a couple of other examples, but Lee Kuan Yew is a rarity, not something you would bet your country on. So basically, betting your country on someone who's going to run the show for a long period of time is a lousy bet, for the reasons I just said. First, I wouldn't have a president anyway, but I wouldn't have anybody ruling for such a long period of time. China's success after 1978 was very importantly based on the regular change of power up until recently, where every 5 years there was a new government put in, and leaders at the top didn't stay more than 10 years, so there was a reliable, institutionalized rotation of power within the Communist Party. Xi Jinping said, no, we should end the term limits for the president of China. We don't know what that means. If it means that he wants to serve for life, this would not be a good thing for China and for Xi Jinping. The thing that made China's politics work well was that it was professionalized. One-party state, yes, but highly professionalized from 1978 onward, with a peaceful, reliable, predictable change of power. And I would recommend that to China or to any other place, no matter what the system of governance is. I believe in democracy, but not as a civil religion, that it is inevitably the best of all worlds. And I definitely don't believe in the U.S. approach of overthrowing other countries, which I think is the stupidest, most dangerous foreign policy imaginable for my country and for others. So I think that all systems have flaws in them. I think that the things that we need as our measures of good governance are rule of law, predictable, regular change of power, privileging expertise in expert systems, transparency, and accountability. And those conditions are basic conditions for reasonable governance, and human rights and standard of law. One thing to remember also is that the whole world signed the UN Charter, and or they signed it or they subscribed to it, the 193 countries, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is an extremely important document, which says that people have political, civil, economic, social, and cultural rights. And that, I think, is very important also to fulfill. Beyond that, we should be a little bit cautious of thinking that there's one exact system which is going to be preferable, but I've already listed about 6 conditions that I think are fairly generalizable across all countries in the world.
Wow. Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. Before we let you go, and thank you for your enlightening lecture and very rich and enthusiastic Q&A, I would like to ask you to please dedicate some of your books to our library.
Good. Great.
And to sign them, yes.
Yeah, of course.
And then once this formality is done, then I hope we can give a big round of applause to Professor Sachs for taking the time. So this book by Professor Sachs will be in the library, The End of Poverty.